Thank you all for coming, and I want to turn this over to Jen Bramley from Cox Communications. Jen?
Thanks a lot, Paul, and good morning to everyone. We're excited this morning to have Allison King, who's a political reporter from NBC Boston and NECN, here with us to interview U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. And I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to introduce the senator. It is truly my honor and a real pleasure to introduce Senator Whitehouse to all of you. In the senator's official biography, there were a couple of things of note in addition to the many accomplishments that he has for our state and our country. The first I'd point out is that he's had over 100 community dinners with the constituents in his district in Rhode Island. And secondly, and I quote, "The example set by people like his father, a World War II veteran and diplomat, and by great figures like U.S. Senator Claiborne Pell and Governor Bruce Sunland, taught Sheldon the good that public service can do for our country." These mentors that he had great confidence in Senator Whitehouse. Governor Sunland named him to be chief legal counsel and his policy director. And he was also the director of business regulation under the governor. And Senator Pell selected him as his nominee to be U.S. attorney under President Clinton. The people of Rhode Island have also shown great confidence in Sheldon Whitehouse, electing him Attorney General in 1998, and then to the U.S. Senate in 2006 in one of the most watched races in the country that year. In the Senate, Sheldon Whitehouse quickly made his mark as an intelligent and strong voice on issues like climate change, healthcare, and the economy. And he serves on a number of committees, which I just want to name so you can hear. Education, Healthcare, Labor and Pension Committee, the Budget Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Environment and Public Works Committee. He's a graduate of Yale University in Architecture and the University of Virginia School of Law. In closing, I just wanted to say that I had the real good fortune as a young political staffer to work in the Sunland administration with Sheldon Whitehouse. So I have seen him in action. On a personal note, I would like to say that I found him to be compassionate, full of hope, and tireless, not only in his commitment to the work that he does for our country and our state, but also to his relationships with his family and his friends. He has a wonderful wife, Dr. Sandra Thornton Whitehouse, who lives here in Newport with him, and he has 2 great children. And we thank you, Senator, for being here today, and I'll now turn it over to Allison.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to the entire NECTA crew for inviting me here to moderate A View from Washington with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Great opportunity for me. We actually did this a couple of months ago at the Edward
Kennedy Center.
Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate in Boston, where we talked about your book, and maybe we'll get to that a little later in the hour. I want to start talking just a little bit about your background. A lot of people in this room, of course, come from all over the New England area, but are maybe not quite as familiar of your background as some of your home state constituents. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you got into politics, what your first steps were, if there was anyone who particularly inspired you, how it all happened.
Well, probably the defining characteristic of the way I grew up was that my family was a Foreign Service family. My dad was a Foreign Service officer. My grandfather had been a Foreign Service officer before they used that word. My uncle was a Foreign Service officer, and we tended to be posted in places that were very poor, at war, run by corrupt governments, all that kind of stuff. So it was not we were not on the champagne and caviar diplomatic circuit. And so you learned really in a very profound way early on that something mattered enough to all of the other American families who were there that they were willing to take themselves to places where there wasn't a hospital, where if you got bit by a dog, it was probably rabid, where you couldn't drink the water, where there were some real hazards to the family, but something was worth it. And my family didn't talk a lot about that, but it kind of hung out there as a notion. And And then the other thing that you noticed is that America was really perceived as different from other countries by the countries where we were posted. My father had an expression that they loved to tweak the eagle's beak because we were so strong. But at the same time, they also had completely different expectations for America as they did for Russia or China or England or France or Germany or anybody else. We were held to a different and higher standard. And that combination of things, I think, has been a very powerful force. On the political side, it was Bruce Sunderland, the gentleman who Jen mentioned, who brought me kind of over from the public service side. I was working in the Attorney General's office to the political side. Why he did not fire me, I don't know. He was a very patient man because I had some, what would you call, rookie start errors. Some of you guys have had some political experience, so let me tell you that when we first got in, the Speaker of the House, who was a practicing lawyer, sent a letter down to me as the governor's new legal counsel saying, why don't you and your legal team come on up? It's important for us to get to know each other. The state's in a ton of trouble. We were having a real meltdown. We're going to need to work together, and we'd love to have you come up and have a beer with us. Really nice offer, right? There's only one answer, right? Sure, glad to do it. No, couldn't get there. Had to write the letter back saying, dear Mr. Speaker, thank you for your kind invitation. I'm sorry you don't understand. You guys are the problem. We are the solution. There's not going to be a lot of fraternization. Respectfully yours. Which letter bounced on his desk for about 9 seconds before it hit the governor's desk, and my phone rang saying, Sheldon, did you just send this letter? Is this like a prank from them? So I've learned a little bit along the way. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
And Governor Sunderland was a remarkable, remarkable individual. I think those of us who served on his team way back when still feel a very, very close bond from that baptism of fire.
That's great. Well, let me tell you also that at the end of all this, or toward the end, we're going to take a few questions. So if you got a burning question, hold on to it, and we'll get there eventually. Saw you on Morning Joe the other morning, by the way. You did a good job.
Good.
Yeah.
Didn't screw
He's
up.
a man in demand these days. So you just got back from a trip to Afghanistan, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, with a Senate delegation visiting U.S. troops.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering tell us a little bit about what that was like, but also, what do you think, given that, Afghanistan had been at war for 16 years, I mean, what kind of strategy should the U.S. be even thinking about in terms of the war on terrorism over there and just bringing stability to that country?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that these congressional delegation trips, I think, are very useful and important. We had a very broad delegation that went. It was John McCain, Lindsey Graham, David Perdue on the Republican side, myself and Elizabeth Warren on the Democrat side. And our purpose was first to go to the UAE and try to send a very strong message that it was really unhelpful to have the Sunni on Sunni conflict with Qatar, and that with all that was going on in the region, nobody needed that. I don't think that message sunk in very far, but I think it was important for us to deliver it. Then we went on to Pakistan, which has been a very challenging country to deal with along the so-called Durand Line, the Afghan-Pakistan border, because for a very long time they've been providing refuge and sanctuary to groups that were killing our soldiers in Afghanistan. The worst being the Haqqani network, probably, but anybody who got across the border could find safety in Pakistan. So if we are going to try to, whatever the new policy that the administration is going to announce is going to be, we wanted to be up to date on what was happening there and also to be pushing to see what could be achieved. And we pushed very hard to press the Pakistanis to be willing to engage in joint operations with us and the Afghan military so that, hammer and anvil style, if you were driving people across the border, there'd be somebody there to meet them and they wouldn't just find refuge. What's interesting is both the Pakistani government and the Afghan government were mad as hell at the other government at providing refuge. So this is a common problem that is solvable if they could work together on a common solution. So that was our main push with the Pakistan government. Interestingly, we flew into South Waziristan, if you know the map, there's that array of old tribal provinces along the Durand Line, and South Waziristan is the southernmost of them. These were the areas that the British gave up on and just said, look, you administer yourselves, we'll just have an agent to talk to you. And to this day, they'd never really been administered by the Pakistani government. South Waziristan, after the jihadis came in and killed, 140 kids in that school in Peshawar, decided, okay, we're going to start cleaning out these tribal areas, and we're going to, I think they took 5,000 casualties cleaning out South Waziristan. It was a place where, in my previous trips, nobody ever thought about going. I mean, CIA officers who went in there got a medal for going in. We flew in the Army Chief of Staff's helicopter and not a gunship. We weren't wearing helmets or flak jackets. We didn't have exotic landing approaches into the base. It was all just very normal. The idea that we would ever see a pacified South Waziristan was kind of unheard of just several years ago. So there was a positive there, in addition to the remaining challenge of trying to make sure that the Pakistanis will, in fact, crack down on the Haqqani network and stop fomenting mischief in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan has its own problems. The two co-executive leaders of the government are a little bit at each other's throats, which is not easy. And they've got really difficult problems. But in the north, the forward operating base we visited, our folks were very, very positive about what their contribution was, what the Afghan army was achieving, new territories that the Afghan army had never held, that it was holding, new capacities to fight and not run that were really strong, and they believed that with a little bit of additional air support and administrative support, not our boots on the ground, they could make an even bigger difference. Go down to the south, and the complexion changes a little bit because southern Afghanistan is to heroin what Colombia is to cocaine. So in addition to all the jihadi Haqqani network, Al-Qaeda problems, you also have really, really strong narco-terror organizations and a whole economy that supports all that. So that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge. But in the same way that the cocaine problem in Colombia was a problem that we had to help address, I think the heroin problem coming out of Afghanistan is a problem we have to help address. So I don't think we can walk away, but we sure have to be a lot smarter about where we interject ourselves.
Well, we certainly could spend the whole hour on just this topic, but in the interest of covering many more, you have been a key leader on cybersecurity, including past chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee's Cyber Task Force, I believe.
Yeah, we wrote the report.
Where does the U.S. stand when it comes these days to cyber preparedness? And for a crowd like this, so what can the telecommunications industry do to help you combat cyber attacks on the nation's infrastructure?
We are not in great shape, I'm sorry to say. I tried very hard to get a bipartisan bill passed to amp up cybersecurity, particularly in the critical infrastructure areas. When the legislation failed, the Obama administration tried to do it voluntarily through what's called the NIST framework, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, I guess. And Homeland Security and NIST run this voluntary process where industry by industry, you come in and try to develop best practices and agree to adhere to best practices. Well, that's all well and good, but the most vulnerable area we've got is the electric grid. Everything else kind of depends on that. I guess a close second is the financial sector, because you don't really have to wipe out the banks. You just have to create a crisis of confidence, like Mary Poppins. The kid can't get his tuppence, and you've got to run on the bank. So you've got to be careful about that. But I think the grid is going to be the real danger. And the gentleman who leads the industry participation in that process was asked not too long ago, should we in Congress be confident that this NIST framework process is providing the progress we need to make sure that our electric grid critical infrastructure is secure? And he said no. And then he paused a minute and he said, let me amend that answer. Hell no. So we have a lot of work to do. This is an area where I think we can do good bipartisan work. Tom Bossert, the White House guy who's detailed to this, is a very good, sensible, squared away, realistic, expert practitioner. The Trump administration policy has been announced, the executive order. Basically, it sent out demand for information to a bunch of agencies, so nothing is happening really now other than the agencies are trying to come back with the demanded responses. And when that's in place, then I hope very much that we will sit down and get to work. There's a lot of good stuff that can be done. We need to red team the NIST process and make sure it's legit. We need to put somebody in place who can tell people what's going on, because most people have no idea how dangerous it is out there. We have to have an inspector general, a roving IG, who can drill into the government websites and make sure that, like white hat penetration, are we as good as we say we are? There are a lot of good ideas out there. We got to get rid of botnets off the internet.
Just a small challenge there, yes.
Yeah, but doable.
Yes.
These are all doable
Yeah.
things if people pull together.
The gridlock and all the division on Capitol Hill is very well documented. Obviously, we all know about it. But what are a couple of your key priorities this year? And who are the Senate Republicans that you can work with, that you like to work with
Yeah.
to get things done?
I would say cyber, climate, oceans, delivery system reform in the healthcare system would be some of the key areas.
Do you feel like as a Democrat, there's just not a lot of effectiveness you can have in that?
I do not feel that. I feel that there is a lot of effectiveness that we can have. And I think that a considerable number of my Republican colleagues are thirsting for productive work. Let me tell you one story. Lamar Alexander, Republican of Tennessee, is the chairman of the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, Pensions. I sit on it. The last big piece of legislation we did was a rewrite of the elementary and secondary education law. It was a significant piece of legislation. Very often, people can agree on something because it's nothing. It's like calling this Georgia Peach Week. Okay, great, we can all agree on that because it's nothing. This was really consequential, and when the bill came out of the HELP committee, every single person from Rand Paul to Elizabeth Warren voted for it. Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray had done the work so that people could get the things that they needed into the bill and get investment in it and see that it was a good piece of legislation and nobody felt rolled or rammed. When the clerk called the vote, the clerk said, "Mr. Chairman, the ayes on this are 19," or whatever the number was, and the nays are 0. And then it's the job of the chairman to say, great, I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make technical and conforming corrections to the bill, just to make all the amendments line up. He couldn't say that. And I looked over, and his eyes had completely filled with tears, and he was too choked up to talk. So when you have a Republican committee chairman who can get emotional about delivering a significant piece of bipartisan legislation unanimously out of his committee, there is hope.
Is that a highly unique situation? I mean,
No, not entirely. And a lot of what otherwise...
I don't think Mitch McConnell's tearing up.
No. God knows when he last, if ever, teared up.
He's no Boehner, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. A lot of what looks like partisanship is not. A lot of what looks like partisanship is the really pernicious effect of Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that basically said you can spend unlimited money on politics. Well, who can spend unlimited money on politics? Somebody who's got unlimited money. That's not a whole lot of people. That's big industries and billionaires, basically. And they have taken full advantage of this, and they've also taken advantage of the places where they've figured out how to spend that money anonymously. And we've done a rotten job of doing what the Supreme Court expected us to do, which is to make sure that all that spending would be transparent, up in the light of day, that if you saw an ad on TV, you'd know who did it. And that has not happened. So that has really powered up this whole dark money political operation. And the terrible thing about the dark money political operation isn't, believe it or not, just the dark money political operation and its spending. It's the threats and the promises that you can issue once you have the power to do that spending. So that has fallen like a pall over the Congress. I mean, there are probably 10 Republican senators who'd like to work on a climate bill. The fossil fuel industry has made it clear that they will have anybody's head who even looks at doing a climate bill. So we have to have conversations, you know, outside of the building. You know, people look over, talking to a Republican senator about climate change is like talking to a prisoner about escape. The first
And do you think
reaction
that
is to look around and see who's.
Is part of that pressure of the expectation that they need to toe the party line, or what? I mean, how do you think some of them? Do you think some
The
Democrats?
expectation is that somebody will run a primary against you, that your primary opponent will have 10 million mysterious dollars that have turned up, that a good deal of the right-wing talk machinery is on cue and can be told more or less what to say, so it will be told to attack you, and that's it. Your career is over. And people like Bob Inglis, a very courageous Republican congressman who had a 100% conservative voting record, is no longer politically living example of that. They took him out in a primary. They beat him with numbers it usually takes an indictment to achieve. And so he's kind of the body on the lamppost telling the rest of the population, line up, pal.
So, you know, you mentioned climate as a priority of yours. I know that's a real passion, climate change of yours. What was it like for you to watch the Trump administration pull out of the Paris climate deal? And, you know, what kind of message do you think that sent? And what do you think it sort of means for the future of the environment?
It was, to me, both sickening and disheartening. I see the climate denial operation as essentially a fraudulent operation. And the fact that the President of the United States, which is an office that I have my entire life held in very high esteem, would kind of get embroiled in all of that is sickening. It's disheartening because if when America does not exert leadership, somebody else will. Nature abhors a vacuum, and other people are going to move in. We've made ourselves look ridiculous in the eyes of the world on this because, I mean, there's really no serious doubt about what's happening. And our unwillingness to do anything, I think, is going to be a lasting blemish on our supposed city on a hill. When I think of what the Greatest Generation did to put America really as that shining alabaster city on the hill, winning both sides of the World War, rebuilding Japan into a peaceful and prosperous entity, keeping peace in the former Japanese sphere of influence, the Marshall Plan in Europe, rebuilding all of Europe, not taking any tribute for all of that, just coming home and going back to work and building a strong America. And now this, it's really frustrating. The problem, the good news is that it's really fired up other sectors. So mayors, governors, businesses, NGOs, regular people. I think in some sense, this has backfired on the folks in the Trump administration who are doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry.
So I've got to ask you about really one of the big hot topic issues down there in DC right now, which is of course the health care bill.
Yeah.
What can you tell us? What is the latest on that? Is it going to happen?
It's hard to tell. As I think we both know, Mitch McConnell is a very wily cat, and he's capable of pulling rabbits out of hats. This is, at this point, seems to be a rather mangy rabbit. So I'm not sure how much they all want to pull it out of that hat right now. The CBO score that I think is probably going to come early next week will be one measure of this. But its fundamental flaw, they've tweaked it in certain ways to make it look more appealing. Dick Durbin on the floor of the Senate not too long ago talked about some of the things in this bill and talked about as them being a lace collar on a pit bull. They put a little bit more lace on the collar with this last round, but the fundamental pit bull of the massive, massive Medicaid cuts, it's going to be hard to figure out how you work around. And when you look at what the Medicaid cuts mean, you've got governors, particularly those who went with the Medicaid expansion, including Republican governors who are livid about it. You've got hospitals, particularly rural hospitals, that are looking at not knowing how they're going to be able to be solvent under that type of a regime. You've got illness advocacy groups like the American Cancer Society saying, not to our patients, you don't. And then you've got just a lot of regular folks at home saying, well, wait a minute, isn't my mom, her nursing home is being paid for by Medicaid, isn't it? And my nephew's opioid treatment, that's Medicaid, right? If we lose that, where does that go? A lot of the births in the country are paid for by Medicaid. So I think some of our colleagues are getting an education on what Medicaid actually is.
You're not painting a strong picture of this thing happening.
Well, they're very, very strong forces that want something to be done. But
so it could.
I think we'd all be better off if Mitch made the decision to just say, look, let's put this in committee. He was the biggest advocate for regular order back when he was not driving this. So let's go to regular order. Let's let Lamar Alexander try to do something bipartisan. There's so much that we can do in healthcare that's really positive, whether it's end-of-life care or figuring out how to improve the way doctors get paid so that they're more vested in everybody's health, or electronic health records, or hospital-acquired infections, or, I mean, you could come out with a bill that Republicans could take home and say, okay, this isn't the victory that you might have expected, but look what I brought you. This is a victory. And that's what we'd like to achieve.
So the bill that a lot of people felt that the Trump administration should have come right out with, infrastructure. I'm wondering what your vision of an infrastructure bill would be and what it would mean for New England. Would you support federal dollars, it's a question for this audience too, or tax credits to support rural broadband expansion as a part of the infrastructure bill?
Yeah, in fact, we put out a proposal very, very early on, the Democrats in the Senate, saying, yes, we're interested in working with you on infrastructure. Here's a layout of the $1 trillion infrastructure promise that you made as a candidate. Here's how we'd be interested in doing it. It does include rural broadband. For me, a piece that is really, really important is coastal infrastructure. We have a lot of coastal roads that get lost when storms come. We are looking at 6 to 9 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century here in Rhode Island. You are seeing really responsible groups like Freddie Mac and leading publications in the insurance industry say, if we don't get ahead of this on the coasts, we're going to have a mortgage meltdown worse than the 2008 Great Recession from the threat of sea level rise, because you can't sell a house that within 30 years is going to be regularly underwater. And you can't get a mortgage on it, and you can't pay for insurance on it, and all of that. So there's some very, very strong warnings that are coming out of those types of places. And we've got to be ready for that. We've got to make sure that we can withstand as much as we can. I mean, we obviously need to solve the climate problem that's causing this, but some of the stuff is baked in already, and coastal infrastructure is going to take a particularly hard beating.
Will that be the one bill you guys will all be able to get together on down
Sure
there?
hope so.
Yeah.
We were told in the Environment and Public Works Committee by Secretary Chow that she would have a draft proposal to us shortly that we could then flesh out using the regular order of the Senate, which I thought was exactly the right signal to send, but we haven't seen it yet. So we're hoping that.
So I mentioned healthcare as the sort of an issue that's dominating down there, but that's not really right. It's really sort of the Russian investigation is what everyone seems to be talking about. And when it comes to the investigation, Russia meddling into the U.S. election, what aspect of this investigation, you, an attorney, former prosecutor, what do you find most interesting or concerning? What are you watching closely about all this?
Well, I watch with interest the signals coming out of the formerly Rosenstein-Benty, now Mueller investigation and try to read the tea leaves. I don't have any direct insight into it, but it's a very interesting thing to watch, and I think it's a very well-developed investigation by now. I think they have cooperators. I think they, at least for a while, had an active grand jury. They may be moving it into the DC grand jury, we'll see. And Mueller has hired really, really good people. So it would be a lot of fun to be part of that group as a prosecutor, I gotta say. The other piece is that Lindsey Graham and I are doing hearings in our subcommittee in the Judiciary Committee. We just had our third hearing and we have several others lined up. And we are trying to focus on what Russia's methodology is when it messes in other countries' elections. We're not the first. They started in the old Soviet sphere countries, and they messed around big time in those elections. And then they thought, that works pretty well, let's push that out into the EU. And they're messing around in elections throughout the EU, and it was in this election that they decided, okay, we're gonna jump the fence and head across the Atlantic, let's try this in America. And it worked beyond their happiest expectations. So every single person who has looked at this, former Republican officials, former Democrat officials, current officials, every single person has said, this ain't stopping. They're gonna be back at it in 2018, they're gonna be back at it in 2020. In some respects, they don't even mind being caught because that just helps add to the turbulence and to undermine confidence. So we have to be prepared and we have to understand what their methodology is so that if there are changes we need to make in our laws, we can make them to build the defenses against what we know are their strategies. And there are two really good reports called the Kremlin Playbook out of CSIS and the Kremlin Trojan Horses out of the Atlantic Council that have kind of, I think, collectively summarized the threat very well. So we are trying to build a record upon which we can legislate before too long to help shore up our defenses against this kind of interference.
That's really interesting. You know, there's a certain sector of Democrats who are very much focused on Donald Trump in terms of his tweeting, that he's not well, that they think he should be impeached. Are you one who gets, caught up in this or spends a lot of time thinking about this, or do you feel like you just need to put your head down and work, or somewhere in between? How concerned are you about Donald Trump?
He's not your normal president, for sure. And a presidency can put people under very, very intense pressure. And what's worrisome about him is if he feels under very intense pressure. Let's say that Jared Kushner or his son Donald Trump get indicted. And let's say that the Republicans begin more to turn against him and he feels isolated. I mean, you see these reports of him fuming and shouting at the television and wandering around alone in the White House and all of that. That's all fine if you're just a developer. If you have the United States military at your disposal, and there are very few checks and balances on the commander-in-chief power of the President of the United States, that's worrisome. So I think it's worth keeping a close eye on making sure that he's within his proper faculties when these decisions get made. Otherwise, I don't really care much about it unless he's attacking institutions that I think are critical to the country. I think that the repeated attacks on the Department of Justice are shameful, false, and low, beneath what any president should do. The idea that this is a witch hunt is preposterous. And to keep saying that, the idea that the New York Times is fake news is preposterous. So when you see attacks on the First Amendment, the Fourth Estate, on the prosecutive process. I mean, if there's one place where you know you're in a banana republic, it's when the justice system is politically attuned. And the repeated pressure to politically tune the department, I think, those things merit resistance because they're touching on really important foundational institutions of American democracy. Other than that, tweet away. Knock yourself out.
So I'm going to go to questions shortly, but I just want to get one more question in having to do with the Supreme Court. There are rumors, there was this big sort of rumor a couple weeks ago that Justice Kennedy might be thinking of resigning. Of course, that didn't happen, but he is in his 90s, I think. As a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, you know, is there any speculation on who the next Trump pick would be, or is there any? Do you know? Are you concerned about this, or?
No, there was a joke going around before he appointed Judge Gorsuch that he was going to appoint Ted Cruz, and do you know why? And the answer was 8 immediate vacancies. So that's about as far as the conversation. That's about as far as the conversation has gotten.
Okay. Well, on that upbeat note, let's see. Are there any questions out there? There's got to be some questions for Senator Whitehouse. I got plenty.
They're not
more.
fully caffeinated yet.
All right. Well, I'll start taking another sip of your coffee, and I'll just keep going then happily. So, you did write a book this past year.
Yes.
And we talked about it, of course, you know, a couple months ago. It's called Captured: The Corporate Infiltration of American Democracy. Focuses on money, corporate power. Why did you feel compelled to write this book?
Because I think we're being snuck up on as a democracy, and particularly with somebody who is as incredibly attention-getting as President Trump in the White House. There's almost no room for political attention to anything else other than his tweets. And if you look at, like, let's just pick the example of political campaigns. When I ran for the Senate 10 years ago, every single advertisement in that cycle could be traced to where the money came from. And every single advertisement in that cycle had a disclaimer across the bottom that said, I'm candidate's name and I approve this message. This cycle, you almost never saw that any longer. You see groups with names like Rhode Islanders for Puppies and Prosperity that, you know, spend $1 million on advertising, and you have no idea who it is. It's a shell corporation. It's a false front entity. You see groups like Donors Trust, which is a huge entity that has been set up with no business purpose whatsoever. Its only function is to take money coming in and give it to whom the donor wants, stripping the identity of the donor away from the donation. And if you want to go back and look at government kind of writ large, the biggest battle has always been between those who profit by influence and those who just want to be left the hell alone, but they sure as hell don't want the profiters by influence to run the show so badly that it's screwing up their lives. So whether it's the courtiers of the Sun King in Paris, or whether it's the, I mean, you can look at Jackson's message vetoing the bank bill about the insiders and what they mean for the working yeoman of America, and you can look at the political theory on this a long, long, long way back. And what I've seen is a huge move just in the last 10 years to where those who profit from political influence have been delivered massive new tools. They had strong tools beforehand. I mean, even in the old days, corporations spent $30 lobbying for every $1 that the rest of the world spent. So when you walk in with a 30-to-1 advantage, you're not doing so badly. Regulatory capture has been a phenomenon in administrative agencies that Woodrow Wilson wrote about, for Pete's sake, and it's capture by the regulated industry. So that's been the baseline, but this whole new dark money enterprise has just powered up those influencers. And it's not all corporations, so let me make that clear. There are very few corporations who have such big interests in government that it's worth their effort and have such big money that they can spend unlimited amounts. And very often it's other industries that are getting screwed as a result of the power of these industries. But what you end up with is a public that looks at Washington and says, nothing that I want is getting done. There was just a poll out that said, I think 3/4 of Americans think they've got no say in our government. That's a tough place to be for the shining city on the hill. And we have to get after these structural issues that allow the persistent influencers to overwhelm the institutions of government so that the legitimate demands of the public don't factor in any longer. That is not a sustainable democracy. And so I wrote the book to kind of lay out the case for how this is happening.
Any kind of reversal of this, though, seems decades down the road.
We could pass I've got a bill that would require transparency in political contributions. The Citizens United decision not only said that was possible, it presumed that that would be the case. Wrongly, one of the many errors in that decision, but there's plenty of room for legislation to force transparency in political transactions. The problem is that all of those folks that want all of that influence in Washington and that achieve it through dark money, their like first order principle is don't mess around with the dark money. We lose that, we lose our ability to do all the other stuff. So it's going to be a tough political fight, and I hope very much it becomes a key part of campaigns so the public really has a chance to decide at an election with hard promises that, you know, if I am elected, we will clean up this mess.
You know, President Obama reportedly told President Trump on his way out, Obama's way out, that the biggest threat, you know, that he should be concerned about, that should keep him up is North Korea. Do you agree with that? Do you think, you know, do you hear things down in D.C. that, you know, in terms of the way the Trump administration is dealing with North Korea? Do you think he's done some good things in how he's dealt with them?
North Korea is a very dangerous country. It's dangerous in certain specific ways. So it's, how do you relate it to, you know, world radical Islamic terrorism? But it is a danger that it needs to be a priority. You have, I think, a fairly unhinged leader in that country, and you have a very weird apparatus and a culture there of obedience and even worship, and no understanding of how you could have an orderly change of administration or anything like that. I went with John McCain to visit Mongolia. Mongolia has come out of being essentially North Korea, right? They were hugely strict, communist, regimented, top-down, cross the government, and you end up in the can country, stuck between China and Russia. They've now gone to a market economy. They've now gone to a parliamentary elected government. They've just had elections and elected a new president. And they have the former president who we were visiting with has kind of this feeling about North Korea that, you know, if you could show them the path. So he's inviting North Korean ministers and school delegations and everything to come to Mongolia and learn about this. He told us the story of the first delegation of North Korean ministers who came to Mongolia, and they had the meeting about what was going on, and there was a question that wasn't being answered. So they asked the North Koreans, there's something we haven't told you that you're interested in. What is the question that's bothering you? And they said, well, we really want to go and see the graves of the former administration. We want to make sure that they were not dishonored. And the president said, hold on, I can do you one better. I can actually go show you the former administration. They're still alive. You can do that. So, you know, you have this kind of strange instinct that you die in changes of administration. Everybody dies, and the best you can hope for is that at least your remains will not be dishonored when there's a change in administration. So, wow, you know, we've got some, but China has almost all the leverage. It uses very little.
And should the pressure be on China?
Yes.
That's the way to go.
Yeah. They have the leverage more than anybody else. I mean, we can ramp things up in various ways, but a peremptory strike at Pyongyang or at their nuclear facilities, they've been preparing for that for half a century. And Seoul is within artillery range of the North Korean border. And you would have, I would suspect, 1 million casualties within a day of doing something like that. So it's really hard to have a military solution that doesn't provoke the full-on hair-trigger North Korean reaction. So really, I think China has the clout and needs to do a better job of using it.
Is Trump's tough talk maybe happening okay, right time, right place, or?
I think, you know, one advantage that he's got is that he rattles people. You know, Richard Nixon had the ability to rattle people. What's this guy going to do? Trump even more so. And that's not, there are times when that can be a little bit of an advantage if it's played right.
Has Trump surprised you at all and done something that you thought was a good, you know, you're a Democrat, so I don't imagine
I've been really disappointed. I thought there was a window for a disruptive, don't care about political priorities and prerogatives, populist, we're going to make this fair for everybody person to come in and really break up a lot of the China in a good way and really go about helping people. And what I've seen is that in choice after choice after choice after choice after choice, they've lined up either with the alt-right or with the biggest special interest in the room. And that's been really discouraging. The extent to which the Democratic Party has been vilified and told you're not welcome here is really pretty remarkable. When Mitch McConnell is making public threats, you better vote for our bill or else I'm going to have to work with the Democrats.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a bunch, guys. We actually worked pretty well when they worked with us on the education bill and on the highway bill and on, you know. So there's a big missed opportunity there, I believe.
I'm going to get to, I want to give anyone an opportunity, first of all, to, is there anyone in there who?
Yeah, we got somebody back here.
Oh, good, great, okay.
Senator, thank you for your time. Could you give the group here your impression of net neutrality, and could you frame your answer around Easy Pass, HOV lanes? Everybody prefers HOV lanes and Easy Pass because it can get you where you want to faster. So I'm just curious on your views in that framework of an answer.
I'm on the open net side. I understand the concern that the old regulatory regime, a part of which was used to defend net neutrality, opened up the risk that the rest of that regulatory regime might be invoked, and that nobody really wants that. I get that. But I also think that it's really important when you consider how many things sort of explode onto the into the market through the internet, that we have as open access as we can on the internet. And the worry that people would become basically gatekeepers and toll chargers on the internet in a way that didn't just compensate them for their service, but actually limited access, I think is a real danger, and I don't know that our antitrust enforcement is up to this in this new area. So I know the issue is more complicated than the way that I see it, but I kind of begin and end with, let's have wide open access to the internet.
All right, great, thank you. I saw a hand over, yeah, right over here, thanks.
I know the senator was part of it, and I wonder what he
Hold on one sec, there's a mic for you, there you go.
Just wondering what the senator thinks your party should take away as a lesson or lessons from how the 2016 election went.
I think people who are election experts are thinking more about this than I am. I'm just trying to get the next thing done. But here's what I notice. If you look at an election, everybody has their field organization. Everybody has their free media, earned media. Everybody has their paid media. Everybody has their fundraising. And even now, we've kind of all stepped over the dirty, rotten line into dark money fundraising and 501c4s. So there's kind of parity up and down on all of those weapons of political election contest. What's new, and even weirder than 501c4s, is weaponized fake news. And that is something that's really hard to deal with. First of all, I think if we go to everybody's going to play by those rules, we've destroyed democracy. You simply can't take that step. We have to figure out how you undo that rather than just try to match the adversary. How do you undo that when you're dealing with content and when you're dealing with a free society with free speech? I think you've got to figure out how you counter it with more free speech about who's behind the weaponized fake news. And that's related to the battle on dark money because it's kind of the same game. But when you have a guy drive from, was it North Carolina, up to a place called Comet Ping Pong Pizza on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., come in with his hunting rifle, shoot the lock off the server closet for the pizza joint because he had been convinced that behind that door were stairs that led down to a dungeon where Hillary Clinton and John Podesta kept children for sex slavery purposes. Wow. I mean, it's lucky nobody got killed in that follow-on event. And if you look at the news around the race, there was the DNC staffer who was clearly killed on the way, by the Clintons, on the way to the FBI handler meeting rather than just being the victim of a terrible crime in Washington. You had the Comet Ping Pong basement. You had fake news outlets like the National Enquirer that just happened, coincidentally, the week of the election to have their headline be a picture of Hillary with Hillary, corrupt, racist, criminal. And then you had these coordinating strategies, particularly the 1,000 Russian bloggers that were being paid to push this. They'd figured out how you could get fake news to people through Facebook. If you put fake news up on the TV, everybody sees it, and you get 4 Pinocchios or you get pants on fire, and you can counterattack on it. When you're coming privately through people's Facebook feeds, there's none of that publicity, and a lot of this information was coming through that. So whether fake news is being delivered by a party in order to harm the other party, or by a special interest in order to terrify people because they can show that they've got a couple of bodies that they've taken out with fake news, so now you got to do it my way or else it's you next, or whether it's Putin, or whether it's the Chinese, or whomever, this fake news thing we've got to get ahead of. And President Trump is not being helpful by calling the New York Times fake news. In fact, he's deliberately trying to equivalent alt-right fake news and the real news for a whole variety of reasons. And I think that's one of the most unfortunate things that he has done. This fake news problem had a lot to do with the turnout in this election and the result of this election.
Coming from the news business, I appreciate that. Is there anyone else out there with a question? How are we doing on time? Who is my timekeeper somewhere?
Yes, we have a question here.
Oh, great.
Senator, I know you said you expressed your concern about having an open internet, and you just mentioned Facebook.
Yeah.
Are you concerned that Google and Facebook and other of those companies from Silicon Valley are completely unregulated, can do exactly what you talked about ISPs doing, is really favor their traffic over others? It's a pay-to-play regime, and yet they can do whatever they want. What do we do about that? How do we address that?
Google and Facebook, and in a slightly different way, Amazon, all have enormous market dominance. To a certain extent, they compete with one another, and they try, I think, more and more to compete with one another. So it's not as if they're a complete monopoly, but if you have a duopoly or a triopoly, then would quickly get worked out, even very informally, or kind of rules of the road about who won't challenge what and what's a good thing for all of us to do, even if we can't collude and agree to do it. So yeah, I think it needs to be watched very, very carefully. And one of the areas where I think it needs most carefully to be watched is with respect to the gathering and use of our personal information. There's been a little bit of pushback when it involves people's kids' personal information, that parents, you got to check in with them, but very, very, very little. And it's astonishing to me. I spent several years on the Intelligence Committee, and I wrote the first Senate Intelligence Committee cyber report. So I've been looking at the question of how we defend ourselves in cybersecurity very, very closely. And we go bonkers over tiny bits of privacy risk when it's undertaken by the government that we elect and that has taken a sworn oath to protect and defend our Constitution. And then we go over into the private sector where there is no such restraint, and we're fine with have at it. I mean, if NSA had 1,000th of the information on all of us in this room that Microsoft, Amazon, and Google have, not collectively, each, I'd be stunned. And the ways in which that information can be abused, I think, are going to be the issue of the decades ahead. Now, some of it is useful. You know, maybe they want to know where you are so that when you walk by McDonald's, they can buzz your phone and say, stop in for free fries, we'll give you some right now because you're a good customer and you want the fries and they want the business and everybody's happy with that transaction. But all of the different things that facilitate that transaction in terms of knowing where you are and what you want and how to communicate with you and all that, it can get a little bit creepy. And where it gets really creepy is when that starts to link up with politics. And now that information is being used to manipulate and control people's votes, or harassing and intimidating candidates, or any of that. So how you keep it from sloshing back into the political sphere is a problem we haven't even begun to deal with. Now, thankfully, I think Facebook and Google got a really big scare from this last episode, and they're trying to clean up their logarithms and all. The fact that Putin figured out how to play Facebook so that he could drive his mischief to the top of the Facebook search, I think gave Facebook a real scare, and they're trying to fix that. Can they? We'll see.
All great questions. I think we've run out of time. Senator Whitehouse, I'm going to ask you one more thing. If you had to pick a Democratic presidential nominee for 2020, who would it be?
No can do. We're going to have,
right.
I would guess, 20 people who are serious contenders.
All right.
And frankly, when you look at where America is right now, to have a big, healthy, full-on scrum is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that the inevitability of Secretary Clinton hindered her campaign, or the appearance of inevitability, and tired out the American public that was interested in a more robust effort, and kept a lot of voices that should have been heard from being heard. And I don't think it served us well to have that kind of a setup in which
Bring it
there's
on.
an inevitable candidate. Bring it on.
Thank you so much, Senator
My pleasure,
Whitehouse.
Allison.
On behalf
Thank
of
you.
NECTA, thank you all for being here, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Have a good day.
Senator, on behalf of the association, thank you for an absolutely fascinating hour. We're honored to have you. It was great. I hope we can do it again sometime. And Allison and Jen, thank you for making all this happen. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Paul.